Yay! It's Joints with JP.
It's a me.
It's a me. It's a JP Joints. Oh, great. We just lost all of our Italian American and Italian listeners.
Bye,
Um,
everybody.
but my wife specifically just turned this off. She's Italian. Italian American. Whew, rough start already. All right, where JP, this is the segment where you and I talk about a craft book or a
Yeah,
joint with
yeah,
JP. Before
yeah.
we get into the craft book that I brought this week, that I'm sorry in advance for. Um,
Great, great start.
I'm not. It's a good book. Um, any updates? What's your updates? What's your personal updates?
Oh, I was not prepared for this. When was the last time we talked?
I don't know.
I don't either.
I don't know when this is going to
Things have
air
been
either.
happening.
So
Good things have
good
have
things
been
happen.
happened.
It's the last time we talked was like March, I think. Not the last time you and I talk. You and I talk all the time. The last
Yeah,
time
yeah, we talk all the
we
time.
did a joint with JP was like in March. It was like three
Yeah,
months ago.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've been playing with Amazon ads, specifically with nerds a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, Giving life back to nerds. Um,
Bringing life
yeah.
back to nerds.
Bringing
Yeah.
life back to nerds. It's been good. My narrator will be narrating next week, I think.
Nice.
Very
That's
excited for
great.
that.
Is
So
that
I'll get
for
to hear
Mandrake
it.
Manor?
Yes. I'll get to
Nice.
hear it in like 2 or 3 weeks.
That's exciting.
Very excited.
That's super
Yeah.
fun. Um, and you're still doing Mandrake Manor on Vela, which is fun.
Yeah, I don't have season 2 ready yet. I'm working on a different project.
Okay. What
Yeah,
project are you
more
working on
cozy.
now?
It's called Mosswood Apothecary.
That's
It's
right. That's right.
yeah,
I forgot about that one.
yeah. They both start with
Nice.
M.
Yeah.
If I just have a whole line of everything that starts with M,
It starts with N, except for nerds. It
yeah.
starts with N, which
Except
means
for
it's
nerds,
like
yeah.
the sequel to all of it. That's how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, nice. That's great, man.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, let's talk about the book. We're talking about,
Sure.
I don't have any personal updates. I'm just editing
Okay.
other people's work. I
Yeah.
haven't written fiction in like 2 months,
Mm.
probably. I've just been editing other people's. I had grand plans for the last 2 months, and then college tuition appeared. And I was like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
I got to make some money. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for today's Joints with JP, we're talking about scene and structure. How can I get
Ooh.
that not to fade? There we go.
Zoom
Scene and
does Zoom
structure.
doesn't even want to show it.
Zoom's like, don't look at this book by Jack M. Bickham. Have you ever read this
Ooh.
book before?
Absolutely not.
Okay. This book, have you ever heard of this book before?
Not until today when I looked it up.
It's part of this series called Elements of Writing Fiction, of which there are like 11, and I think I've
Okay.
read 3 or 4 of them. Um, this book was actually sent to me when I lost a writing competition. So there was
Oh.
not the book itself, it was recommended to me. There was a competition in which we were supposed to send in story pitches. They're like, send in your best
Mm-hmm.
story pitch. I'm calling it a
Mm-hmm.
competition. It wasn't actually a competition, but that's what I'm going to call it so nobody can figure out what it actually was. They're like, send in your best story pitch. So I wrote, like the true obsessive compulsive weirdo that I am, I wrote 13 story pitches. And
Oh,
then
okay.
I sent and then I sent them to my reading newsletter. I was like, hey, vote on these. Which ones do you like? And of course, they voted. And they voted for one that was about a comic book store owner and a who was very angry about COVID, and a uh, comic book enthusiast who had locked herself in her apartment during COVID and wasn't ready to rejoin the world, both undertaking a treasure hunt that their favorite comic book writer left in the comic book. And they kind of like are competing to find the treasure, and then they like come together to find the treasure, and then the treasure ends up being friendship. So I was like, that was the one my readers picked. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I know that I wrote that story pitch, but that's not the one I want to do. So I sent in the story pitch that was about a therapist who didn't like people being whose estranged sister dies, and he becomes the legal guardian of his 5 nieces and nephews. And
Okay.
chaos ensues. And through caring for his nieces and nephews, coming from this broken family, he learns to open himself up to people. That was the one I chose. I think the people I sent it to would have liked the first one better. I made the wrong decision. And
Yeah.
they marked up my story pitch that I sent them um, aggressively. And then at the end told me, you should go read these 5 books. And
Nice.
this was book number 1 that they told me to read.
Nice.
And I did. So if
Nice.
they're listening to this, I did read those 5 books. And
I
they were
bet you
great. I am actually very appreciative. They were good books.
I bet you at least one of those judges was on your newsletter and they were just pissed that you didn't pick the one that they voted for.
Oh, that's possible. That is possible. Um, yeah,
Like, oh, there
that's
should have
actually
been a
kind of
comic book
possible.
on.
Yeah,
I don't
um,
know.
it's possible. I was shocked that my newsletter read 13 pitches. I was like, this is
Yeah.
nonsense.
Well,
Yeah, anyway. So but I'm not bitter. Like the feedback on the pitch was funny because I was like, I know how to write conflict. I just picked the least conflicted story to send you. But they left me these 5 books. I was like, oh, I'm gonna buy all of them and read them. So I did. So today we're gonna do the first one of those. Um,
perfect.
what do you know about Jack M. Bickham?
No,
Have you ever heard of the Apple Dumpling Gang?
it's still no.
Really? Well, I'm older than you. That was an old
Yeah.
Disney movie with Don Knotts in it.
Okay.
I'm not Apple Dumpling Gang old, by the way. That's not how old I am, because that would put me at like 60. I am conservative evangelical, um, Gen X millennial old. My parents only let me watch G-rated movies for a while, and the Apple Dumpling Gang was
Oh,
one of those that
I
passed the test.
I grew up on only like horror movies. I think
Nice.
I was shown The Exorcist when I was like 6.
That's
So
really funny.
very different.
Yeah, very different upbringings. Yeah, we had a weird house that, like, if it was something I wanted to watch, it had to be like G-rated, and it had to like meet all the like qualifications of like evangelical purity culture. If it was something my dad wanted to watch, all of a sudden it was like everything went out the door and we could watch whatever we wanted. So I remember I was like
Yeah.
11 and he showed me Tom Berenger's, I think it's called Sniper. And there's a scene where a guy gets a knife jabbed to his eye. Like, it was like super graphic. And I was sitting on the couch like, I don't know what I'm watching. And my dad was like, it's fine. So anyway, it was
When will Mickey show up?
yeah, I was like, where's Don Knotts and the Apple Dumpling Gang? Anyway, Jack M. Bickham lived from 1930 to 1997. He is no longer alive. He published 75 books, which is crazy to
Nice.
me. A lot of them were in his Baker's series. It's like a mystery detective series. And 2 of them were made into movies, The Apple Dumpling Gang and Baker's Hawk. This book was written in 1993. And part of what I want to do today is, as we go through some of his advice, I want to ask you, JP, is that still real? Because a lot has changed in writing and publishing since 1993. We're kind of in a
Oh, great.
different world now.
Oh,
So
great.
yeah, I just want to go through that. All right, are you set for this adventure? Any thoughts before we take off?
I just, you said he published 75 books and you thought that was wild to you. So I went to your Goodreads. You have 36 results. So,
That's because Goodreads breaks paperbacks and ebooks into 2 books sometimes. And that's a
okay.
nonsense thing.
Okay.
He
But
actually
I'm
wrote
just saying, I don't
75
know.
individual books.
All right. Whatever. Anyways, I was just throwing that out there.
I do have a secret life goal of 100 books. I want to publish 100 books. But
Okay. Well,
this last 6 months where I wrote no fiction is not helping me achieve that goal in any
no,
way, shape,
definitely
or
not.
form. Yeah.
No.
Um, and you know what else is not helping me achieve it? When we write nerds and they're like 140,000
Hmm.
word books, that's not getting me to my 100 book goal.
Well, I don't know what to tell you there, but we're still gonna do it, and I'm just waiting for the next episode. So
Come on, I'm actually we're kind of stuck because you only gave me one episode to describe a haunted, abandoned um uh amusement park. How do I do that in one? I
Okay.
need like 7
Do
episodes
do it
for
in okay, do it in 3 episodes. And
that. I need like 10 chapters for that. I could have a rompus just on the Ferris wheel. Um anyway,
I'm sorry, I derailed us, but
you did it. Were we
I
on rails? Okay,
no, we never were.
this is the problem as stated by Jack Bickham with modern
Okay,
publishing. And I would like for you
great.
to know, I'm going to read directly from page 1. I would like to know if you still perceive this as a problem. I actually really like this book. It's got really good things to say, but I'm going to continue my tone of mockery. All right, page 1. Mention words such as structure, form, or plot to some fiction writers, and they blanch. Such folks tend to believe that this kind of terminology means writing by some kind of formula or predetermined format as rigid as paint by numbers portrait. He goes
Cool.
on about this. He says that like the problem with modern fiction is that fiction writers hate structure and plot.
Huh.
Does
I
that
mean, that's
that was the
wrong,
problem
but
in 1993?
I mean, will you still find people that think that? Yeah, of course. But no.
Yeah, it's I felt like reading the first chapter. I was like, man, has the pendulum swung in the other direction? Jack Bickham
Yeah,
would be like
yeah.
living his best life in today's modern fiction.
Well, I mean, when did you say he died? 97?
97.
So, I mean, ebooks, right? That's really the big difference here is there's
Yeah,
so much more access to self-publishing to ebooks and therefore having categorizations under genre that become hyper fixated to the point where you can get tropes on very specific niches. So
yeah.
all of that causes structure. And so I think that this is just something he could have never seen at the
He could,
time.
yeah, he just didn't know. And I think it's interesting. I've recently been really compelled at the power of the search bar and how
What?
so Google just recently made an announcement that they're replacing their search with AI. And
Oh,
I actually had,
it's not good.
can we do a big aside? Let's do a big aside. Google
Great.
just made an announcement that they're replacing their search with AI. And I was on my phone and I Googled, um, what was I Googling? Oh, best ways to saute shrimp. Because
Oh,
I'm the cook
good.
in the family. So I was like, I'm
Nice.
just curious to know if anybody's got any tricks, jokes, and tricks. And usually I'd get like 5 articles from Google. I'd read like 3 of them. And as PJ Vogt on the podcast search engine said, when you Google something, you get a research project. And that's kind of what I'm used to getting. Instead, their AI just answered me with like 7 tips called from all these articles.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. I didn't get a research project. I just got an answer that I only like 40% trust. So
Yeah, yeah.
it got
So
me.
the thing that I was the thing that I was seeing was someone was asking about cheese on pizza and it said to add glue, like Elmer's glue. And the
Oh,
reason was because someone jokingly put that on a Reddit thread and
nice.
Google can't differentiate between like logical and nonsensical advice. And so my understanding is that they rolled it out before giving it broader context.
That's hysterical. Yeah. So it was the advice for sauteing shrimp was actually pretty good.
Well,
Um,
good.
yeah, but it made me start thinking about Amazon and how with our genre tropes and our niches and all this stuff, what we've actually been writing to is the search bar in Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
We've
Mm-hmm.
actually been writing to the search bar. We write genre tropes hoping to make the magic search bar put our book at the top of the research project it assigns to people. And if
Yeah, yeah.
Amazon goes the way of Google, all of that is gone because they will stop giving the research project of like, here's 10 books that, and the top 3 have been paid for. They'll stop
Mm-hmm.
doing that and they'll just start being like, this is the book you want. Um, and I wonder how many readers will go like, no, I want to see the next 4. I bet most readers
Yeah.
are like, yeah, I'll try it. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, So Jack Bickham, we're starting a little out of touch with modern literature. He does have a
Yeah.
fascinating history of literature in here, and he skips a lot of steps. He's like, first, fiction was only written in personal letters. He's like, and then we move from personal letters to people telling stories as if you were sitting in the living room with them. And then the modern novel emerged. I was like, I'm not an English history major, but I think you're skipping steps. I don't think there's just
And
3 steps to modern novel, but
no.
that's what he lays out in the book.
How does writing letters go before sitting around, basically sitting around a fire and telling stuff? But that's fine.
Well, because he was talking about like what you write down. He's like, first we wrote down letters to each other and we told stories in letters. Then we just wrote down stories for the sake of writing down stories. And I was kind of like, I don't know, man. The Bible's pretty old. And, there are texts older than that too, like that aren't letters. But anyway, I thought it was fascinating. It's just an interesting history of form and structure. Where I was like, Jack, I love the Apple Dumpling Gang, man. So this is a fun quote. Wait, was I going to read this quote? Oh, I was. So he gives us 2 definitions that he's never going to return to, by the way. But
Great.
I found them interesting, so I'm going to make you suffer through them. The first one is structure. He calls
Mhm.
structure as a way of looking at your story material so that it's organized in a way that's both logical and dramatic. And this is a big thing that he says storytelling has to be logical and dramatic. He does come back to those 2 things over and over again, logical and dramatic. And then form is what you've done with that structure. So if you think of structure as like the building materials for a house, you have like bricks and wood and drywall and nails and all the things that go into a house. I don't build houses. If you do that, if you have that, that's the structure. The way you put the house that you build is the form. And then he talks about how he's going to focus on specifically structure. Here's another quote on the problem that I thought was fun. This is on page 4, if anybody's reading along. To put this slightly a different way, most successful fiction today is based on structure that uses a series of scenes, which is what the book is actually about. That part's not, I'm not reading, that's an aside. That can, see, now I messed it up. If only I edited podcasts, the most successful fiction today is based on structure that uses a series of scenes that interconnect in a very clear way to form a long narrative with linear development from the positioning of a story question at the outset to the answering of the question in climax.
Interesting.
Any reflections on his definition of story?
Uh, I think that it's missing a few things.
What do you mean? It's perfect.
Well, I immediately think of like the outliers, right? Saying that a story follows a linear path. There are plenty of stories that negate that, right?
Yeah.
They have strange temporal things. I think
He does mention
trying
those
to
and he kind of brushes them off. He's like, there are
great,
these stories that
love
don't,
that.
we're not going to talk about those. We're talking about the good stories.
Those are good stories. That was
No,
rude.
not according to Bickham. No, I'm just putting
I
words in his mouth.
I mean, it's a viewpoint. It is a viewpoint.
Okay, so he goes then into chapter 2. And in chapter 2, he's like, how do you start and end your book? And he's like, this is the most common question I get asked. How do you start and
Mhm.
end your book? I'm just bringing that up because the structure of the book, scenes and structure, um, sometimes isn't meticulously structured. And this is a problem I have in
Yeah.
general with most craft books. Most craft books, I feel like this just feels like a bunch of essays that you put in a random order. His has much
Hmm.
more structure than that, but anyway. So in that, how do you start into story? He says, These are facts about readers. So
Okay.
I'd like you to respond on facts about readers. Will yeah, we have to remember the following facts about readers when we're writing the start and end of a story. Number one, they are fascinated and threatened by significant change.
Okay.
Number two, they want the story to start with that change. So readers want to be fascinated and threatened at the start of the story. They want the story, they want to have a story question to worry about. So they want to be threatened at the start of the story, fascinated and threatened, and then they want to worry about something for the
Right.
rest of the story. They want the story question answered in the story ending. So they want to worry about it till the end. And he does talk a lot in here. These are all things that he's going to talk a lot about. So I'm kind of setting up the premise of his book. And five, they will quickly lose patience with everything but the material that relates to the story question.
Okay. So we want our
As the writer of the story hypothesis, how do you feel about Jack's interpretation of threatening our readers and then worrying them
yeah,
for the
yeah,
entire
right.
book until
We
the
want we want
end?
our readers to be in therapy? I don't understand.
Anxiety. We want anxiety. You know,
We want
early 90s was a
anxiety.
different time. There's way more
It
cocaine.
was. It was.
There was a
Oh,
lot less, you know, that's not true. There was a lot of anxiety, but we weren't really listening to marginalized people groups, so we didn't have to hear their anxiety.
no.
We
Yeah,
could
no.
just pretend like everything was great.
Yeah, yeah. I think that though using those words and that those choice words uh is a serving of a small subsect of needs that people want. Because people do want that. People do want the high action. They want to feel that rush when they read. That's not everybody. Some people want to read something that's nice and cozy. Some people want things that aren't as threatening. Maybe
They
they
don't want to be
want,
worried.
a
They don't want to worry
romance.
through. I should say he is primarily a thriller writer. So I do
I
feel like
couldn't tell
thriller.
at all. Could not tell.
As a fellow thriller writer, I actually kind of related. I was like, yeah, I kind of want you to like murder somebody at the beginning of the book, and then I want to worry
Yeah,
the
yeah.
entire book that somebody else is going to be murdered. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation of this is without intentionally doing it, I feel like he might have narrowed his scope and then tried to do broad strokes of definitions.
Yeah, I think so. I do like he's going to talk a lot as we get into his structure. He has a system in this book of like how to
Hmm.
write a scene. And that's what I found really valuable in the book. It's where I'm kind of joking around with like these first passages, but I do want to spend time in his system of scenes because I think it's actually scenes and sequels, which is a weird term that he chose. I don't understand
I've
why.
heard of those before.
I don't
Yeah.
know why he chose the term sequels. It was very confusing because I was like, wait, we're writing the second book? And I was like, wait, no, this is in between scenes. I'm confused as to why we're calling these sequels. But there's scenes, maybe there's a definition of sequel. I'm not smart enough to know. Or maybe I'm pronouncing the word wrong. That's also very possible. It's possible I'm spelling sequel wrong and pronouncing the word wrong. Hold on one second. I have to hit pause and check. No, I was spelling it and pronouncing it right. Okay, so we'll get
But
there.
I do want to talk about readers though, because I do like the I'm gonna go.
You
You
gotta
Google away.
just plow through me. You know me too well to let me have this much time. All right.
No, but I do want to talk about like there is things that I take from that, like starting off with a question that gets answered. That's what storytelling is all about, right? So like in Mosswood Apothecary, the cozy queer fiction, I'm not threatening my readers and I'm not making them worry, but I am opening up a question of like what a strange world this is, and like maybe a little bit of worry about like is my main character going to graduate? But I'm not like putting the reader in a situation where they're like, "Oh my God, this character's going to explode," and or something like that. And like the feeling that I want them to have as they read through is more along the lines of like joy and warmth. And like I want them to read a chapter and be like, "Wow, that was so much like a hug that I want to keep reading." And there's that emotion that is very different than making someone worry to read the next chapter, but it still serves the same purpose because it drives them through the story by supplying them a different emotion.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I think you and I both agree that something he doesn't talk about at all that I think is severely missing from the book is that what the reader really does care about and is worried about is, will my character change in a way that makes this possible? Right? Like you were saying, like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, will my character graduate? It's like, yeah, will my character become the person they need to be? Like that's the central
Right.
thesis of a story, which you lay out very well in the story hypothesis everyone should go by. Um,
Oh,
but
thanks.
it's he never connects this stuff to characters. He's very plot
Yeah.
focused. It
Yeah.
reminds me very much of, I would actually say this book is a prequel to the write fast, publish, repeat style of writing. It's very much like,
Mm-hmm.
this is what needs to be in every scene. This is how you get every scene done. This is what comes in between the scenes. Now you're on to the next scene. Let's go, 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 get those scenes done and get to the next book. Like it's very much in that style. He doesn't talk about genre tropes, but again, like you were saying at the beginning, we were pre search bar days. So I don't know that
Yeah.
genre tropes and niches actually mattered um as much to him. Uh he has an interesting thing here. This is on, for anybody reading along at home, on page 9. He talks about the length, how long your story should be, um, which I just thought was fascinating. How long should your story be? As long as it takes, with general physical and page limitations mentioned earlier. Earlier, he goes on about how like your publisher is going to give you a set number of words because this is only for trad publishing, by the way. He doesn't
Yeah.
Indie publishing isn't a thing. I mean, it was a thing, but it wasn't recognized as a thing. That's a whole different story. But he doesn't recognize it as a thing. He's like, your publisher will tell you how many pages it's supposed to be. Uh the answer to the story question you pose at the outset. So it says, as long as it takes to answer the question, where should you start? At the moment of threatening change. Which kind of reminded, it's like violent language, but it kind of reminded me of like Vonnegut's, like, start as close to the end as you possibly can,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a nicer way to say that. You don't have to threaten everybody, Jack. So how and when should you end the story? By answering the story question. However, you have to show this to your reader, and whenever the story time the answer is found. Oh, and whenever in the story time the answer is found. Which I don't, yeah. Do you need a lot of subplots? No, but you can certainly have some if they're relevant to the story question. And does it have to be a happy ending? By no means. I mean, come on, we're threatening people. It has to be it has to be a fitting ending and an ending that answers the story question. So that's his kind of like summary of how to structure your book. Um Now let's get to the stuff that I actually think is like
All right.
meaningful and will help people. So he talks about fiction. He says fiction has to make sense. It has to be credible to the reader, which was
Mm-hmm.
something that I found interesting. And he has a whole chapter about how reality is not credible. How like in
Mm-hmm.
reality, crap just happens. You just run out of
Mm-hmm.
gas, or your tire just goes flat, or like you just like get sick one day. And he's like, but readers don't tolerate that in fiction. There has to be cause and effect. So like effects, plot developments have to have causes. And he talks about that at the story level, that like cause and effect happens at the story level. And then it's the same principle, but he just uses different words. At the scene level, it's stimulus and response. There has to
Hmm.
be a stimulus, and then things have to respond to it. And you can't have a response without having had some kind of stimulus. And unanswered stimuluses irritate the reader because they're like, aren't you going to do anything about that?
Yeah.
So all effects have to have causes, and responses have to have stimuluses. Effect and cause at the story level, response and stimulus at the scene level. And remember, all of this is couched under his system of like, there's a question being posed, and then you have these cause and effect things happening to answer that question. And each cause has a stimulus response, effects have stimulus response. Does that make sense?
It does. Um, adding more texture to that answer. I think that this sounds very prequel-esque to like the three-story method, but it pulls away really strongly from the like these things being in direct effect of the main character or the main person, as opposed to how three-story method really focuses on that main character making these or being very active in participation.
Yeah.
So I can see, yeah, I can see like the two getting very close to each other.
Yeah. Three-story method, for those that might listen that don't know, Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon wrote that in it. They have the three C's: conflict, choice, and consequence. And like you're saying, it's really the insertion of that choice that
Yeah.
makes it stand out. Now he is going to insert something here in the middle. I haven't gotten to it yet, and I'm withholding it because he withholds it at this point, which
Hmm.
I think is actually important in his description of this, because he is really, and I will say, I found this type of thinking. I read this book, I don't know, last year when I got that letter. Um, but I have used this in editing a lot, because you do have, like, there's a tendency for us to write stories in which like things just happen.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that's like Deus ex machina. That's like God in the machine putting his
Yep.
hand in it and making things happen. There now, I prefer what you're talking about, where like it's the choice, emphasizing the choice of the character as like bringing about the consequence. But I do like the whole like there has to be a stimulus and a response type.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I see stimulus just like I see conflict, but both of those words, like whenever I go to explain that moment, I focus more on using a word like words like emotional turn or like the turn of a scene, because
Yeah.
there's a shift that happens in that moment, and it can be something super minuscule like a piece of information shared that is given to the main vehicle or the main character in the story that alters their perspective of what's happening, or it can be a bunch of people running into a room with guns. Like
Yeah.
both of those can be a big turn in a scene, and that's
Yeah.
sort of how we see it. And then the response being either the choices that the character makes or the fallout of what happens later on because
Yeah.
of that stimulus.
So Jack, on that note, Jack goes into six things. I am like seriously summarizing this book. It's a thick book. It looks small, but the type is very
Oh,
tiny.
great.
Um, so it's a 90s book. So I'm just I just want to, I'm not actually going beat by beat. I'm like skipping a bunch of stuff. But he does outline like key things to making your story credible. And then he says like mistakes we make
Hmm.
in the stimulus response. So key things to making the story credible: the stimulus has to be external. That is action, dialogue, or something that could be witnessed if the transaction were on a stage. I talk a lot about like the stage of the reader's imagination. He doesn't talk about that. He talks about, I find a lot of similarities between how we describe story and talk about story and how he does, which I found affirming when I read it. And I almost wrote back a letter that was like, I do this. But so he
But he's good.
I'm gonna keep bringing it up because I'm not petty or bitter. So he you know who you are. So he talks about this actually like taking your novel and putting it on a stage, and like I should be able to see the stimulus happen meaning the stimulus should never be internal to the character. It should always be something external that's happening. Response must also be external in the same way. So the stimulus and the response of a scene, he claims, both have to be things that are people talking, people moving, people interacting, which we call dialogue. For every stimulus, you must show a response. For every desired response, you must provide a stimulus. Response usually must follow the stimulus at once. So, like, something happens and then a response happens. He doesn't like waiting, which is funny because in a minute he's going to tell us to wait. When a response to a stimulus is not logical on the surface, you must ordinarily explain it. So then he goes into mistakes, common mistakes made in the stimulus response. What page is that on? How have I lost that? Ways to mess up a stimulus and response. Okay, here we go. You can mess up a stimulus response transactions in 3 ways. Number 1, you can show a stimulus and then show no external response, or perhaps one that doesn't fit or makes sense. And I've actually found this in editing where people have like, this happened, and then she bought a microwave. I'm like, no, that doesn't line up. Like, she got in a car crash and then she bought a microwave. Like, no, those aren't causative. That's not good. Not cause and effect.
So I have a question here. And give me your perceptions. So let's say we're writing some type of Game of Thrones-esque moment.
Yeah.
We've got high political intrigue going on.
I'm
And
threatened and worried the entire time.
Threatened and worried whole time. The stimulus is information being passed into our main vehicle about the death of XYZ.
Yes.
But that character, us being in their head, we know what they're feeling, but they do no external response at that moment because they're withholding that response to do a bigger response later.
He would say the withholding is the response. As long as
But
I can
that's not an
see the withholding
external.
happen. I have to see it happen. I have to see the person withhold their rage.
So like bite their tongue and all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah, or look at somebody and be like, we're not acting now, Ned. We'll act later.
So it has to be externally vocalized.
According to him. Yeah, action
I disagree
and vocalizations. Yeah. He gets to internalization in a second, and I actually find what he says about internalization helpful. But we'll get there. But I do take your point. I do think he is much like his heightened language around, like, you have to threaten the reader and then make them worry the whole book. There is a like maxim to this system of like, it has to be external. Everything has to be external. And it is very like thriller writery. It's very like mystery detective writery. Like, we have to see it. Number 2, ways to screw up. You can show a character response when no stimulus or credible one, for it has been shown. Sorry. The writing, Jack, you're freaking killing me. He's saying when you have a response with no stimulus, when somebody like makes a decision and there hasn't been anything that predicated that, no conflict that predicated that decision, that's a mistake. Jack, you're killing me. Number 3, you can put so much story time between stimulus and response that the logical relationship between the two events is no longer evident. I feel like he's speaking directly to your example. I
think there's a hefty payoff that happens.
Okay. Then he adds, so we've got stimulus response, right? External, stimulus response. We understand his system. You and I both have some hesitations toward it. Like, this feels like a simplification of things, but I get what you're going for. He then says that pattern is the basic pattern, but the real pattern is stimulus internalization response. and that this is the true pattern, that this is the deeper reality of how things work in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the stimulus always sets things in motion. And then the character is going to think about and process the thing that just happened. And then the character is going to make a response. So this is his addition of choice that the character makes, that there's a conflict, choice, and consequence. The conflict and the consequence, to speak three-story method language, always have to be external. The choice is internal. And you have, for him though, a scene has to have all three. You can't hold your consequence, or like, yeah, you got to have all three.
Interesting.
Thoughts, reflections, pushbacks,
I mean,
revolts?
in the same vein that three-story method functions, it doesn't encapsulate all of storytelling. Um, Even if they want them to, it doesn't.
Yeah. Every system is
Yeah.
flawed. Yeah, and I
Yeah,
will
every
say
system's flawed.
he does in the end of book what every in the end of the book what every craft book does, which is he then tries to take this very simple story structure that he's building and make it, and then give caveats so it
Yeah.
falls into every story ever. And the caveats get so complicated, they completely erase the very simple formula that he's built here of stimulus, internalization, response. So the
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
book, and I'm not even going to get to that stuff because I'm like, getting to the caveats, why? Let's stick with the simple formula. I'm a simple formula dude. So I do
Yeah.
feel like there's something good to learn here, in that, like,
100%.
if you accept his system of like stimulus, internalization, response, then the stimulus and the response being external, meaning, to summarize his meaning of like, it has to be through character interaction. I think, and you have to be able to, the reader has to be able to visualize it on a stage. I think that's true. Like, I like that understanding. And I think it makes our scenes grounded in the present and in reality, which he doesn't really talk about. But I like this idea that we're going to ground these in the present and in reality. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, anyway, that was I like what he's doing there.
Hmm.
Okay, here's an extra editing exercise he gives us at the end of this page. He says, for every stimulus, ask if you show a response. For every response, have you provided an immediate and external stimulus? Because he does say you can flip those. Like, when you're writing, you can show the response and then back up, like, give me a flashback to show me the stimulus, but it has to come right away, right? Like, in complicated transactions, which is what I'm talking about, where you start complicating the formula, have you provided the reader with an explanatory internalization? So, like, my example before, she wrecked a car and bought a microwave. Was there a moment where I was like, oh, she recognized that she'd received money from this and she would use that money to buy a microwave, so she's just going to go ahead and buy the microwave, right? Like, do we,
Right.
when the stimulus and response don't actually make sense to each other, do you give an internalization that justifies the action? And then the last question is, are the parts presented in the correct textbook order, except when you want to confuse the reader?
Wow, that was rude.
I really like Jack. So are the pilot, because you could just see him in a classroom teaching and be like, hey, are you putting stimulus, internalization, response in order? And they're like, no, no, I thought I'd be creative and I'd do this thing. And it's like, oh, so you want to confuse the reader? Like, I love it. Um, yeah, anyway, I think, I don't know. What do you think? Any nuggets there?
I mean,
I'll take your
does it
silence as
work?
no.
Well, like I mean, this is a really good opportunity for someone to learn story structure. But my caveat is this is story structure from an American white guy from the 1930s to present.
Writing
And so
thrillers.
if you want to learn a thriller story structure from a white guy in the US, like this is a good way to
Yeah.
do that.
Who
And
seems
you
to
can
think that
expand
threatening is a good thing.
and there's nothing wrong with this, but I think it's the recognition that like this isn't the one and true way. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think the more that I like love to learn about story structures, the more I realize that like craft books are great for tools to pick up on and recognize who is writing them, because they never encapsulate how a story is told
Everything.
in other
Yeah.
cultures and other groups.
Yeah. 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 Okay, let's keep going with Jack. Because
Yeah.
we're only halfway through what I wanted to talk about today. So he moves from there to talking about like to getting into scenes. So like he's talked about
Mm-hmm.
like the components of a scene, and I was going to talk about like let's talk about like what your scene needs to look like as a whole.
Yeah.
So his definition of a scene is a segment of story action written moment by moment without summary, presented on stage in the story now. It is not something that goes inside a character's head, it is physical. So he's like, your scene has to, and this is something I actually tell writers all the time. I have to be able to visualize it on the imagination of the story. If you're summarizing action, I have to be able to visualize it. You can't just tell me like after 43 years he got a master's degree, right? Like that's a fantastic fact that you've given me. That is not a scene, right? Like I have to have
Mm-hmm.
a yeah. So and I felt like that's kind of what he's saying here.
Yeah.
Um, he talks about a scene fundamentally what a scene is the statement of a goal, the introduction and development of conflict, and then the failure of the character to reach his goal, which he calls the tactical disaster.
Ooh.
And he is big on scene for the next like 4 chapters that every scene should end in disaster. In fact, let me give you a
Oh,
good
okay.
quote here about scenes.
Threatening
And
people
yeah, the
and
scene
making
needs a
disasters.
goal, but then the goal always has to end in disaster. Every scene has to end in
Great.
disaster. Disaster in this usage does not often denote an earthquake, a flood, or a plane crash, or anything like the things we often term disasters in real life. But the use of the term is justified because the character and the reader, and I actually really like how he like connects the two of them, because we do that too. That's why we use the word vehicle and not
Mm-hmm.
hero. But yeah, the character and the reader experience the final twist in a scene as thoroughly bad,
Mm.
disastrous to the alignment of the immediate scene goal, and so a terrible setback in the quest for the story goal.
Wait, how many of these? All of them?
In other words, I've skipped down the page. In other words, because he like actually poses the question that you just asked. In other words, you cannot allow the answer to be yes whenever whatever the character wanted, whatever the scene questioned, the answer must be negative.
Okay. That's interesting.
So the premise here that he's talking about, to defend Jack a little bit, I'm going to try. The premise that he's talking about is that if you answer the story's question in a scene, then the reader feels satisfied
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't need to keep reading. He's
Right.
like, so never answer the story's question. Now, he calls not answering the story's question the disaster. I don't know that
Right.
we need to call it a
That's not a
disaster,
choice. That's not what you need to do.
but that's what he calls it, the disaster. Um, yeah, so I don't know that that's necessary, but he's got that like so the scene to rewind the structure of a scene. You present the goal of the scene. Here's what we're doing. You then create a conflict. Here's why that can't happen. And then you end that conflict in disaster. And oh no, everything fell apart. And now we have to have the next scene. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean,
You're like, the problem isn't comprehension, Jeff.
Well, it just I the choice of words here is very peculiar. Um,
It reminds me, it is like a Die Hard America. It's like Bruce Willis
yeah,
on Nakatomi
yeah,
Tower with his like multiple machine guns and his bare feet cut up with glass telling me how to write a story. That's how I
yeah. Well,
feel.
and the way that I understood what you just said was that a scene proposes a goal slash question, and that goal slash question is not given by the end of the scene. Correct?
No, the question is answered, but in a negative way. So,
Right.
because
Because if
there's
they get
it goes to the stimulus response again. So there is an
right,
external stimulus, which is your goal, and then there's a conflict of like, oh, I don't know that we're going to achieve that goal, and then you don't achieve that goal, but you do have an external response. So it's not that nothing happens; it's that a negative thing happens.
but like, what about on a hero's journey where one of the obstacles is that they need to get a physical object, a key, and they enter the scene and they get the key because the key gets them closer to getting the answer that they need.
I don't have to read the rest of the book.
My answer.
Yeah,
Well, like you know what I mean? Like I don't think that uh, I can see how you want to propose the question of will they get the goal that they intended 100% of what they wanted versus will they get it at a varying level or at a cost of something. I think that that's more encompassing of more storytelling.
yeah. And I, he doesn't really get into it, but I think his overall point is what you're saying, that like they can get the key, but in getting the key, they need to realize that it's not actually the answer they wanted, and that like,
It was the
oh, it doesn't
friendship that
actually
they had all
solve
along.
anything. It was the friendship they had all along. So they find the treasure. The comic book store owner
They're
deals
no
with his
longer threatened.
anger. The woman has to come out of her house and hang out with him and meet him, and you think
Should
they're
have
gonna have a
submitted that one and then we
romance,
wouldn't have had this book.
but they don't.
Hmm.
And the treasure they find is friendship all along. And my readers were
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, write that book." And I was like, "No, that book's stupid. Um,
And here
no,
we are.
I'm gonna write the bad therapist book." Okay. So, issues of the scene. Do I even want to talk about this?
Yeah.
Okay. It's good to remember that you can err by setting up a scene goal for which a disastrous ending may be too final. If your
Mhm.
detective George enters a scene with a goal of kill or be killed, the chances are quite good that his disaster will be killed. Where do you go after you've killed the central character? I think the book just ended. The reverse, I didn't say that he wrote that. The reverse, I realized that sounded like an aside for me. That wasn't, that's Jack. The reverse of this coin must be considered too. It's cheating, and the reader won't like it a bit. If you set up a goal with which will lead to an outcome that isn't at all final. So that's the problem. That's the problem with goal setting in this scene. Um, I was going to skip that. You made me read it. Here's another passage.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like your response to this one because this is a weird aside. He hasn't talked about characters. Dude,
Yeah.
he's only talked about plot and structure, and then all of a sudden he does this. It's this kind of scene handling error, incidentally, that usually can be found in the work of a novelist who complains about losing her way in the plot. I love that this is suddenly a her.
Hmm.
Sorry. So 90s white dude. Sometimes they even say something like, I don't know what's happened. My characters have just taken over the story. Characters don't take over stories! Exclamation point. Characters don't exist except in your imagination. When you think a character is taking over your story off in the wrong direction, it's like the real culprit is your failure in technique. the introduction of
Wow.
potentially damaging angle in the conflict part of the scene. There are a couple other places where you can inadvertently send your story off the wrong vector, and we'll get to those in due time. I don't know.
Wow.
My characters constantly take my story in weird directions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Like I told
I
you,
think
you gave
that
me one scene for a haunted amusement park, and I need like seven. And the reason I
right,
say I need seven is because I'm like, the minute they get out of the car, they're all going in different directions.
right. Well, honestly, I think that that's the difference between I mean, there are myriads of people, but I think that's the difference between someone that is very hyper fixated on plot and will force character personalities into that plot regardless, and people that are more focused on character development and recognize that certain personalities, when you reach a point in your story and you've been able to sit in that personality and in that, like, basically you're method acting, but you're just playing everything out in your head.
Yeah.
But when you reach certain points that you wanted them to get into and do, you recognize that they will not, and that they will not do the actions that you wanted them to do because that personality does not match that action.
Yeah, and I think that's part of like what we preach here, the gospel of the dialogue doctors, is that this all has to be character centric. Did you just hold up a hand like Jesus? That's amazing.
I I
um,
really did. You're welcome.
yeah, I loved it. Yeah, it's that, and I'm going to start using that phrase more. The gospel of the dialogue doctors. It is that, man. We need a book. We need a book called the gospel of the dialogue doctors. Anyway, but it's not going to be a nonfiction book. It's going to be like a thriller in which I threaten you at the beginning of the chapter, and then I make you worry the entire book.
Great.
So every chapter is going to end in disaster. So
Great.
anyway, sorry. Um, I think that's the difference between his plot driven focus and like, hey, these scenes need to like continue the action, and then actually like putting something in character. And it's interesting. Like in a minute, we're going to talk about sequel, um,
Mm-hmm.
and how he uses sequel to kind of bring the character back into focus, which I don't like necessarily. Uh, anyway, there's I'm trying to decide how much more of this we want to do, and if we just want to move to sequel. Let's do his tips on writing good scenes.
Okay.
There's 42 of them. I'm just kidding.
Oh, great.
It's on page 42. The goal of each
Meaning of life.
scene must clear. I just want you, this is how we're going to do this. I just want you to say true, false, or maybe. Is that
Great.
fair? Okay. Tip number one. The goal of each scene must clearly relate to the story question in some way.
Maybe. I would say false.
Number two, the conflict must be about the goal of the story.
I'm gonna say false or maybe to all of these.
That's why I wanted to play this game. Number three, the conflict must be with another person or persons, not internally. I actually say
Again,
true. I say true on this one.
I don't know. It depends on the book.
The
What
first
if
two I
you
was
have
with
internal
maybe.
beings?
This one I'm
What
with
if you
true.
have what if you're writing like a book with either internal two voices in the head?
I have worked with authors who are like, I have a scene with only one person. And I'm like, we'll get them talking to themselves because we want that conflict external.
Hmm.
So we want them like talking to themselves or talking to an inanimate object or talking to something. Get them, don't give me a chapter where it's just like, paragraphs and paragraphs. But then I read James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and his first 25 pages are all internal. And it's the most amazing reading I've ever said. So now I tell
Okay, so
authors,
false.
yeah, no, now I tell authors, you can have a total internal chapter if you write like James Baldwin.
Great.
Number five, disaster. Disaster works, moves the story forward by seeming to move the central figure further back from the goal. leaving him in worse trouble than he was before the scene started. He has a whole section on like the progress of a story is actually backward progress, that like the best stories, the characters getting farther and farther away from the goal until the very end when they achieve the goal.
Maybe.
Okay. I'm surprised that got a maybe. Number 6. Readers will put up with a lot if your scene will only keep making things worse.
No.
Yeah, I disagree with this one. I actually do tell authors that readers will put up with a lot if you have good dialogue and good character voices. They'll tolerate a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
nonsense if you have great character voices.
yeah.
Uh, Number 7, you can seldom, if ever, plan, write, or revise a scene in isolation of your other plans for your story, because the end of each scene dictates a lot about what could happen later. In other words, he's saying you have to be a plotter. You have to know where this thing is going.
Oh, okay. Well, no.
Anyway, all right, those are his tips for good writing. Let's get to the sequel, because I think the sequel stuff is interesting. So, what chapter is that in? Chapter 7, he starts talking about sequels and transitions. So, and it's funny, he talks about transitions, then he never talks about them again. He's like, these exist, and
Right.
I'm going to connote that they exist, but then I never talk about them again. So, transitions are a simple device which provides a direct statement to the reader to the effect that change in time, pace, or place or viewpoint has happened since the last scene. So, like, you start scenes with phrases like the next day, or later that afternoon, or once they arrived at the playground. That's if you're going to have scenes with no sequel, which again is a terrible word to describe what he's about to describe. If you're going to have scenes with no sequel, you have a transition. Sequels are what he wants, though. Sequels are the glue that holds scenes together and helps you get from one scene to the next. It is the flexible structural component, and it provides you with all the tools you need for in-depth characterization, analysis, motivation, explanation of character planning, etc. Ideally, this comes in between each scene. So let me read you a sequel example. Oh, here's the example. Sorry. A sequel, this is on page 51 for everybody reading along. A sequel begins for your viewpoint. A sequel begins for your viewpoint character the moment the scene ends. Just struck by a new, unanticipated, but logical disaster, he is plunged into a period of sheer emotion, followed sooner or later by a period of thought, which sooner or later results in the formation of a new goal-oriented decision, in which turn results in some action toward the new goal just selected. So Jack's process here, very anti-cognitive behavioral therapy, by the way, is emotion felt, thought from the character, decision made, movement into action, you then get the response. So if you think of this as like that piece of the that he's talking about in storytelling where you have conflict, internalization, response, this is his like internalization. Or if you're thinking about like how his scene functions in the goal, conflict, disaster, this comes like immediately after the conflict. We have this period of thought. Actually, I'm sorry, it would be goal, conflict, disaster, then this period of thought,
Right.
resetting of the next goal, conflict, disaster, period of thought, resetting the next goal, conflict, disaster. So ideally, this sequel comes between disaster and goal to like
Hmm.
process what just happened, take stock of things, and then give us the goal. Um, the formal structure of this sequel is that, and he breaks all of these down in detail. I'm not going to make you do that. Emotion, thought, decision, action. That's how he like lays it out. Cognitive behavioral therapy would say automatic thought, feeling, action, but we'll break that for Jack here. Any thoughts on sequels?
I think it that the concept of them, like when I'm thinking about thriller movies, because I have to relate this to our good friend Jack, this is that moment right after a big action scene where you're basically recuperating. You're taking stock of what happened,
Hmm.
making sure you're not bleeding out too much or stopping the bleeding, and
Yeah.
then making the next decision as to what we're going to do next.
Yeah.
So they make sense in that type of storytelling, because if you just had action, 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 action without these moments in between, you would tire the reader more so, and they wouldn't feel so threatened because they'd be exhausted.
Yeah, he has this I will read this. He has a contrast between how scenes and sequels make readers feel. And I will say, I'm going to caveat here. I like the concept, but I'm going to break it in a minute and tell you why I don't like it. But scenes are exciting, conflictful, densely packed with action and dialogue, and therefore fast reading. Sequels, on the other hand, are thoughtful and can be extended, have a summary in them, and are therefore slow reading. To put this another way, scene portions of your book seem to the reader to go very fast. Sequels go much slower. You can control the pace of your novel at every turn by how you handle your scenes and sequels. So we talk about this in the Gospel of the Dialogue Doctors, that but we phrase it differently. We say dialogue, or the interaction between characters, moves quickly, and reflections is what we call them, expositional reflections, move slowly. And he's using them in the same way that we do. He's just
Hmm.
using them as like their own set alone components, whereas we're like, hey, a scene might contain multiple segments of interaction. In between those segments of interaction, pause to give us perspective through a reflective expositional paragraph. So, like, let your characters interact and play, and then when they come to an emotional turn, or they come to like the end of a topic and they're about to start a new topic, let your POV vehicle pause for a second and tell us how we're supposed to feel about what just happened, and then move
Hmm.
into the next section. He's just doing it on a bigger scale. Um,
Right.
and I don't know that I like his bigger scale. This is part of the reason I specifically try to move us away from plot discussions and move us into character growth discussions, because I think this kind of patterning actually gets boring, of like
Yeah.
action, pause and think, action, pause and think, action, pause and think. And to be clear, I'm on page at this point 65, and the next 130 pages are caveats as to how this gets changed in actual practice. And I kind of come to a place where I'm like, if you're going to caveat this so much, then it's not actually a rule anymore. It's just something for you to build off of to talk about story structure in general. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. It does. I mean, like I was saying, when I'm thinking about his story structure, it pulls me to thrillers and action movies that are from his time period,
Yeah.
from the 80s and the 90s, because they have that formula to them. They're fun to go back to, they're fun to enjoy, but actually, I would say a lot of successful modern day thrillers and action movies don't have that formulaic of a structure to them. There's almost always this attempt to break and change it in different ways. So I think that when considering his structures, it's a great foundation, but it doesn't reflect modern storytelling as much as you probably would want it to.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I watched The Goonies this week with my kids, because we're always looking for like movies, because I have a 21-year-old and a 10-year-old. So I'm always looking for like things we can watch as a family that span that they'll both be interested in. And so I told them, like, hey, Goonies works because the lines are so funny, you'll hang in there even though the plot is stupid. Um and makes no sense, because like, who set all these booby traps if the pirate was trapped in a cave his entire for the rest of his life and died in the
Yeah.
cave? Like, who set all these booby traps that they're having to walk through? So Anyway, it does function this way though. There is a high action scene, and then there's a moment where they're like yelling at each other, and then there's a high action scene, and there's a moment where they're like yelling
Hmm.
at each other. There's another booby trap. There's like a moment where they're yelling at each other. Like so, it does function in this way. Um, but yeah, and it does seem to be complete disaster until the very end. Even at the end, they're on the beach. I'm about to spoil Goonies for you. They're on the beach, and at the very end, um, the maid that doesn't speak English recognizes that they accidentally did take some treasure in a marble bag, and they have enough to save the house. You get the very ending is the like, oh, there's not a disaster here. We're good. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Uh,
we solved the question.
yeah, we solved the question. Anyway, and the question being, how do we save the house? We
Right.
found treasure. Yeah. Um, yeah, any what are any strong takeaways from the book that you're like, that's good, and I'll probably hold on to that.
So I've actually heard of Scene Sequel before. I like the concept of it. Like I said, I like the concept. I really like the stage thing, too, which you said you use, and I haven't used it before, but I really like the idea of thinking in terms of stage play as opposed to cinematic, because I think a lot in
Yeah.
cinematics, and that gets really easy for me to easily move the camera around in ways that you can't or you shouldn't. So I think that concept of stage is a really good takeaway for me.
Yeah, I don't I didn't get hit. I didn't get the image of stage from him. It's just how I've always thought about story, but I like stage over cinematic because cinematic often when I'm imagining something in a cinema format, I'm depending a lot, even in my imagination, on like the music and the like,
Hmm.
like you're saying, the camera movement and the tones of what's happening to raise emotion. Whereas a true stage play, you just have dialogue. And so
Yeah.
that's why I always talk about like, hey, story is on the stage of the reader's imagination. The reader's the only audience member sitting in the audience, imagining your story. Are you giving them enough to understand the emotional tone of
Yeah.
what they're are? Do they have enough scenery on the stage to actually know where they are? Did you crowd the stage with too much scenery? Anyway, but I liked his. I don't necessarily like his language about disaster and threatening the reader,
Yeah.
but I do
The,
like his focus on the external because I
hmm.
think we get into. I think going internal with our storytelling can be a crutch where
Hmm.
we're like we use internal thought too much to move the story along, not realizing that that is not as fun as we think it is.
Right. Right.
Like it's more
Yeah.
fun to
It
have it happen on the stage.
it is difficult for me to internalize with the verbiage that he's using because I'm really in a more like cozy storytelling place at the moment. And I'm having a lot of fun um trying to play into more of the slice of life moments and more of that like Eastern storytelling, uh, because I want to pick apart that structure.
Mm-hmm.
I really love like Miyazaki movies, and they're very different from Western storytelling. They
Yeah.
have a lot of slice of life moments, and there's like big world events that can happen in those stories, but at the same time, the characters may not be as directly involved in those big events. And like I don't know how to explain it very well, but there's something about that. And so what I've been doing, and what I play with the most is like these moments in Mosswood Apothecary where we're just sort of like having a picnic and just enjoying the day and being able to interact with characters and maybe talk about the events that are happening around them and saying like, oh, it's because things travel by train and things take time. It's been a few weeks since XYZ's been here, and all this sort of like catching up moment, but really sitting in those moments and enjoying it. And uh ideally writing well. I mean, people like them, so something's happening there. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what's making it a little bit difficult to connect because that's not the storytelling that I'm working on at the moment, but I can see its use.
Yeah, I understand. I'm with you. I think what makes that Eastern storytelling really great um is like what drives you to those moments of life are the emotional interactions between the
Yeah,
characters. Like
yeah.
I just did a bender and watched all four of the Satoshi Kon anime movies.
Hmm.
Millennium Actress, Perfect Blue, The Four Godfathers, or the Tokyo Godfathers, and oh, what's that last one called? Paprika. Um,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of scenes where this scene isn't necessary for the
Right.
plot. This scene doesn't impact a massive amount of things, but this scene endears me to the characters in an interesting way. That like,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'll take time in this scene because I enjoy being with these people at this moment, and it doesn't always have to be high Avengers octane where like Iron Man and Hulk are punching each other in the face. You can like take a beat and just enjoy being present with no strategic motivation to it. And I think that's
Yeah,
super
yeah,
true. And it's not a sequel. I'm not describing a like, oh, this is a moment of reflection between moments of action. It is just a like, this moment exists because it's a nice moment and it's fun.
yeah,
Usually they're very
yeah.
with Satoshi Kon stuff. All of those moments that I'm imagining, they were very fun. They were like
Yeah.
entertaining and or moving. There's like a scene in Tokyo Godfathers, which was an incredible Christmas movie about three homeless people. It was the most. Have you ever seen it?
Mm-mm.
It's three homeless people who find a baby in the trash on Christmas Eve. And one of them is a trans woman, and one of them is an old, drunk, kind of beat up guy, and then one of them is a runaway teenager. Who seems non-binary through most of the show, and I was shocked because it was written in the early '90s, and I was like, "Man, this is super progressive for the early '90s."
Right.
But it's there's a scene where the old drunk guy kind of stumbles upon another old bum and just has a moment with him in his little hut where he thinks he dies, and then the old bum doesn't die, and then he like kind of comes back to life, and then they kind of, and then the old bum does die, and then they run into some people that like beat the crap out of hit the our main character bum and the old bum that died that like they beat up his corpse, and like it's a weird moment of deep social commentary that is completely unnecessary to the plot of the movie. It has nothing to do
Right.
with the end goal of the movie, or it's just a moment of Satoshi Kon being like, here's a moment of personhood with these two characters that are ignored by society. Now let me show you society being very mean to them. All right, back to our story in progress.
But like the interesting thing about that too is uh, that is put there intentionally,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that's the thing that like I'm working on understanding that structure because those pieces are put there intentionally. And when I was starting off new, I probably wrote something that I felt was maybe similar to this or that I felt was necessary to the plot, but it wasn't. And now I'm working towards like it's sort of like a reflection of that, but
Mhm.
still being able to have it be intentional and have it have that texture to it of like depth of character and connection that I wasn't able to produce beforehand.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it is antithesis to the like right to genre trope superstructure,
Yeah.
super plot that we've lived in for so long. Um, I think, but I really like that kind of character driven beauty. I do think it creates a different feel to your book. It's not a like, oh, I'm going to rip through this book in a night, throw it down, and pick up the next, you know, Western romance on the high seas niche that I love, vampire Western romance that I've read four of already. Like you're not going to get
Wait, are
that.
you serious?
No, no.
I was like,
But
is
that
there
doesn't
really a
sound
vampire?
bad, does it?
Do I need to write this
Western
down?
vampire romance. I'm kind of here for that. Let's do
All
that.
right.
Um,
No,
Yeah.
let's finish nerds, but okay.
No, no, no. Haunted amusement park, Jeff. Haunted amusement park. Um, so yeah, I was looking at haunted amusement parks on the internet last week, trying to figure out how to keep this to like 3 scenes, but it did blow it up to like 10. Because I'm like, oh, what about a haunted like I was like, what about a haunted house of horrors? Because it's a house of horrors that's run down and haunted. So now it's like a horror house of haunted horrors. Anyway, um, yeah. So you're like, no,
I'm not
you're
gonna
like,
add to
I
that.
don't care.
No. Mhm.
All right. Any other thoughts on before I just continue to ramble for a while?
Uh, I mean, this seems like a good starter, right?
I think if you're struggling with structure, if you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really fighting how to structure a story, I would first read Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And then if that doesn't help, I'd read this book.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd read that one
That's fair.
first. And then I'd read because this isn't an easy read. This is like you heard me tripping over a lot of the sentences. It's not a like, I'm gonna breeze through this thing at night. This is like
Yeah,
a college
it's
professor
dense.
assigns this to people because it's dense and it feels like a textbook. And yeah.
Yeah. But there's some good basics
There's great
in
basics
here.
in here. It's an interesting perspective that I think is worth struggling with. That's why I brought it. Because it's like
Yeah.
this is an interesting perspective that I think is worth battling with, and the kind of like battle with it, I think makes us better writers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't see
Yeah.
anybody
Yeah.
reading this book and not being a better writer. I think, but I don't think they're a better writer because they put it 100% into practice. I think they're a better
Right.
writer because he says, threaten the reader. And you have to be like, wait, should I threaten the reader? Wait, should I do that? Like, I think that makes you better. Asking the question, should I threaten the reader, makes you a
Yeah.
better writer. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Don't threaten your readers. That's
Make your readers anxious. All right. I think that's it. I'm going to turn off the recording. We can talk a little bit more.
all right.